Afternoon, and thank you all for attending, and also thanks to Republica for the invitation. This conversation builds actually on a conversation that Amanortey Kisseih and I had at Republica in Ghana, and so it sort of extends that debate and conversation around repair cultures, which I'll explain a little bit more about. In the last 2 years, I have established with colleagues in the UK and internationally a network called Repair Acts. It's an international and interdisciplinary network of people working on topics relating to repair, care, and maintenance cultures. We view repair and maintenance as the challenge to move away from the rhetorics of the new as a means of progression and innovation. Questioning the lexicon of the smart and the globally connected, repair, care, and maintenance cultures address the everyday consumption by revealing the geopolitical struggles, labour systems, and consequence of our material lives on the environment and other species. So instead of looking towards progression and the onward traction of technological development, we focus instead then on the disconnect and what is broken and the discarded, and we look towards imagining how we can redefine growth in those kind of ways. Repair Acts is very much situated within artistic thinking within this, and I will go through some of that type of thinking here in the next sort of 2 minutes. But as a point of reference, I'd like to turn to Jack Berman, who was an art curator writing in the late 60s, early 70s in New York. And he wrote about this idea of systems aesthetics. In the past, our technologically conceived artifacts structured living patterns. We are now in a transition from an object-orientated to a systems-orientated culture. Here, change emanates not from things, but the way things are done. And I'd just like to emphasize that the way things are done is what we're actually speaking towards here in relation to repair. I also situate this conversation in what is kind of known as eco-feminist critical thinking, drawing here on Donna Haraway, the cybernetic thinker, biologist, and author. In her recent publication, Staying with the Trouble, she kind of calls for leadership and new ways of imagining how we kind of go forward, particularly in relation to the ecological crisis that we're facing. Quoting Haraway, "A humanity with a more earthly integrity invites the priority of our pulling back and scaling down, of welcoming limitations of our numbers, economies, and habitats for the sake of a higher, more inclusive freedom and quality of life." So this conversation, again, is couched in this idea of what are these limitations and how do we welcome them and how do we shift this conversation towards different forms of economy. Repair Acts is also contextualized within the UN sustainability goals, which may be familiar to some of you, but just to recap here, there are 17. And in particular, we're looking here at number 12 around responsible consumption and production. But also, of course, when you look at any one of these, they're all interconnected in a way. Traditionally, when we spoke about, let's say, repair, reuse, and waste management, this was the typical kind of pyramid that probably since the 70s has dominated the conversation. What is interesting here is that you actually do not see the word repair. Of course, you see the word reuse and recycle, and also reduce. But this actually kind of very language is actually what we're trying to challenge, because repair actually shifts the conversation further up the manufacturing chain in a sense. If you repair something, you automatically produce something of a higher quality. You automatically produce something that has a longer lifespan than the limitations that are put on the consumption patterns at the moment. And taking up this challenge, we have, of course, multinationals who are leading on this conversation. In particular, I'd want to make reference here to Patagonia, who declare repair as a radical act and who pledge to ensure that anything that they make has that lifelong guarantee in a sense. And they've also given a lot of money towards, more recently, towards the environmental causes within the US. Speaking towards policies within the US, Despite some climate change deniers, the US have been leading in some ways in the forefront of this conversation, and I make reference here to ifixit.org, which was established in 2003 when a programmer couldn't fix his laptop in Silicon Valley. And it produced then this kind of conversation, and now which is one of the most notable kind of spaces online for looking at repair manuals, tutorials, and so forth. iFixit also led on developing the Repair Manifesto, which for those of us working in open source, open data, and so forth, and open hardware, can actually kind of affiliate with some of these calls. So repair is better than recycling, saves you money, teaches you engineering, saves the planet, connects to people and things, etc. I'm not going to read out all of these points, but I think you get the feeling here. More recently, in 2013, also within the US, the Repair Organization has been set up. Previously, the Digital Right to Repair Coalition, this organization advocates and lobbies at a policy level for repair legislation, and various different states within that have made that possible within the US. Of course, making a law and legislation is one thing, it's enacting it is another, and there are several cases that have been kind of profiling in this, from John Deere and tractors to Apple, etc. Also, most recently in London, Restart have been galvanising policy and thinking and advocacy from the European side, and have been very much involved in the European directives that have been going towards repair legislation here and which are still being worked upon. Again, established in 2013, they also hold Restart or repair parties in a sense, which tries to encourage people, similar to the Repair Cafe movement in a way, to get to know, bring your object and develop your understanding of how actually you can increase its longevity and also learn different skills. And again, just to kind of close on this particular section of what's happening in various different points around the world, of course, Sweden, who have also brought in tax breaks for repair. And what that means is, one of the main arguments against why people don't repair is actually the cost of it. In some ways, it is a privilege to actually repair something in the first place, because at the moment, for the most, it costs more than actually buying something new. So what they did in Sweden was trying to encourage this by, if you repair something, then you can actually get a tax break on it, and the person who's doing the repair doesn't also have to charge the VAT on it. So there are some ways then that this has been incentivized in certain countries. So this is just a small little kind of quick recap on positioning where this conversation is happening in a kind of more institutional and kind of policy level. There's also been an academic turn, you could say, as well as within art and design on repair, but actually where that now sits is kind of a little bit open, and the next part of this conversation is going to just kind of provide a bit of a summary for that. The Repair Act network also was very important for us to bring together those thinkers academically, policymakers, NGOs that were working in the space. And that was also one of the reasons for establishing it. But I'd like to flag here some recent work that I carried out with my colleague, Carmela Pietrangelo. I was interested in looking at how we can actually map, basically, changes in repair practices across a period of time. And as some of you might know, in terms of the Anthropocene conversations, there has been this big shift in actually how we consume since World War II, in a way. So we went back to that kind of period and took a snapshot using 1 square mile as a lens. This is from my home in Bedminster in Bristol. We took snapshots in 1938, 58, 78, 98, and 2018, and we basically looked at all of the repair businesses that would have been registered as repair businesses in a sense. And this graph here shows some of the sort of trends in a sense, the changes within this particular locality. Just to flick back here to this particular map, this distribution here just highlights 38, 58, and 2018. What you'll see here is that there is these clusters, and these clusters are situated around sort of the main streets and the main shopping streets in this locality. Bristol was heavily bombed in the war, so actually this changes from the blue and the pink dots to the yellow kind of reflects that in a sense, and it also reflects changes in the urban dynamics and composition of the city, just to explain a little bit more in detail. What is more interesting, though, is to kind of point out here, I guess, this particular actual chart here. What you'll see in 1938 is there actually is a lot of repair. There's there's substantially more, like about a third more repair businesses than was registered in 2018. However, what is more interesting in a sense is the diversity. Yeah? So you could repair in 38 clothes, electronic goods, or your car, potentially if you had one at the time, there's not everybody did, boots, shoes, furnishings, decorators, hardware, watches, bicycles, etc., etc. What we get then is the reduction in that diversity in 2018, and obviously then the increase in particular types of goods, for example, in the electric and in cars and in auto. What's really significant here is that very top colour here, the pink, that's representing clothes, dryers and laundry. Now you can see how little repair is happening in that particular area, and I think the fashion industry is trying to address that, and the fast fashion sort of reflects that. But speaking more here in the context of this conference, in a sense, and event, is actually the electronic repair services here. So obviously when we look at something like 1938, we see these trends with radio and TV and video, and sort of some very little domestic goods, because people would have actually had a sort of shared collectives in a sense. You wouldn't have had a washing machine in your house. You would have gone to the gone to a local centre or to a person, usually actually a woman, who would have washed the clothes for you. As we go through here to 2018, what you actually see significantly really in 2018 in comparison to all of the other years, of course, is mobile phones. And that is actually the dominant type of repair that now happens in this particular locality, with domestic appliances still kind of being kind of quite high, and as you'd imagine, their growth from 1938, particularly with the turn post the 50s and post World War II of sort of like this more automated life and consumption in a sense, and the rise of the teenager, etc., etc., all basically encouraging a more consumer-led society. So I just wanted to give you a flavour, in a sense, of how we're sort of beginning to kind of look at this kind of mappings in local places as well. And recent research has also shown that in actually evidencing repair practices in local communities, you can actually increase kind of wealth, well-being, local economies, etc., because major internationals obviously don't pay so much attention to such local specificities. However, as a practicing artist, I think that alongside this turn in the last sort of decade in terms of the policy, and as I said, the academic turn as well, I think that artists have been leading this conversation in some way, and I refer back here to Berman's idea of this systems aesthetics that kind of came about in '68. Also referring back to this particular time, Marleya Lederman-Ukeli's brought out her manifesto for maintenance art, where she talks about the death instinct and the living instinct. And she refers to the death instinct in sense as this kind of particular emphasis that we have on the new, in a sense. And, you know, you have to kill off something for the new to kind of emerge. While actually maintenance, care, that's what the daily life is sort of about, in a sense. It is this constant, if not boring, in a sense. She calls it even the unsexy of what the everyday requires in order to keep a system alive. It is, as she was calling it, you know, the duty to take care of your children, the duty to take care of your house, in a sense. And she was working at a particular moment, you know, when flux arts was being, you know, the dominant form of art, and you would have also, she was coming again from a feminist perspective, reflecting on these particular nuances. One of her key and most famous projects is called Touch Sanitation, where she literally went around and shook the hands of every one of the thousands of workers that worked in the sanitation department in New York. She was the unofficially named artist in residence, and the longest one in a public sector body such as the New York Senate. A beautiful piece of work which brought attention basically to all of the people that are involved in keeping the city and the system alive. Also around this time, as I was sort of like explaining with this trend in kind of consumption, we also begin to see artists critically reflecting on mass consumption. And you have Reid here, who's considered as the father of circuit bending. Circuit bending is one of the techniques, in essence, that are part of artistic practices around kind of basically taking broken objects and creating something with them, using the particular aesthetics of the breakage, in a sense, as the way to articulate the feeling.
This piece represents the absolute cheapest one can go in home computer art. This involves taking a $300 video game system, pounding it with your fist so the cartridge pops out while it's trying to write the menu. The music here is done by Dick Ainsworth using the same system, but pounding it with your fingers instead of your fist.
So digital TV dinner there, a kind of a flavour of that kind of particular thinking back then as well. I mean, they're specifically actually breaking the cartilage and forcing the break, because game consoles are kind of some of those first mediums which were kind of read-me only, and you couldn't actually kind of write on them. So the artistic practice of actually breaking the format through which you could then actually open up the process was actually what was happening here. Again, building on those traditions, you have Tone, who worked with Wounded, his albums and his music on Wounded CD, specifically scratching the CD so as to kind of again break into the system, because it was a read only. Giving you a little flavour of it. Oval, also in '95, releasing their first ambient track. German group, classic ambient techno. Again, all with broken CDs. And Rosa Merkman in more recent years, lamenting the collapse of PAL and standards and formats. Just a sample there in a sense, which is making reference to Keel's Blue Angel and so forth, and the idea of looking at history in the past and essentially reimagining kind of like what this means in terms of standards, of course, are one of the ways through which kind of upgrades and repairs and the kind of the push of a new device can actually come through. And then more recently, the modified toy orchestra, and refunct media, where loads of broken media is again pulled together to create the aesthetic in its sense. So this is just to give you a flavour of the type of work that artists have been actually kind of doing, which was, I guess, in some ways contextualised by Cascone in the turn of the late 90s, early 2000s, as the aesthetics of failure, the language of the post-digital, detritus, byproduct and background, all being in a sense actually kind of one of the key things here that kind of we're working with. Fragility being also an element of this kind of discourse as well, as illustrated here with the boxes that were made of glass and sent around by FedEx and basically turned up broken, how little we care about things, I guess in some ways a nod towards that. Linda Brothwell, based in Bristol here, learns craft techniques and repairs benches in different cities, making the repair visible in a sense that you're not actually negating what is broken and you're acknowledging that. And some of my own work here, which actually looks at using waste products, in a sense, what's thrown out in the street to kind of create reflections on surveillance society and so forth. So that's just a very quick sort of snapshot of some of the artistic practices that have been dealing with this issue in terms of repair, care and maintenance. There's also been, as I mentioned, a sort of an academic turn, but then in the academic turn there has also then been, of course, professors that are thinking about this in relation to how we actually teach design within schools, how we actually teach architecture within schools, how we reimagine how we think about technological development, engineering, software, etc. I just want to make two references to this. Both the colleagues who have been also involved in the Repair Network, Ramlabur here, their floating university, which took place in Berlin over the summer last year, looking at, as they said, an offshoot campus for cities in transition and what it means to kind of live in a more sort of off-grid, sustainable, low carbon kind of way. And forthcoming in Nevers in France, colleague Ben Goulon, who is running a 2-week residential school with a number of designers, focusing on those who want to critically engage in these topics, particularly around the environmental impacts of information and communication technologies. So what's actually happening is these conversations are actually also located in some ways outside of academic institutions, although they're pulling in and resourced in some way partially by them. The kind of core topic is yet to kind of really push the education and kind of curriculum. In a sense, though, repair and maintenance has been what the critical geographers, Graham and Thrift, would call the engine room for modern economies and societies. And they consider that a need to actually kind of, again, shift this conversation around these notions of growth and progression that we have, because they actually acknowledge the more geopolitical struggles and conflicts. Jackson refers to this as the broken world logics, acknowledging that contemporary life is about dealing with the coming apart of things, where breakdown, dissolving change, rather than innovation, development and design as conventionally practiced, and that he calls for new technological scholarship and leadership within this area. And I think that's very important in this respect, particularly within conferences like Republica, that we begin to actually have this conversation about what that means, because it is the shift that is kind of required. And Jackson here is referencing the ship-breaking series by the photographer as flagged here, in where these things actually, where the sites of actually waste happen is often in the global south and outside of the northern hemisphere. And so I'm transitioning now into the second part of this kind of conversation, which I will share with my colleague Kisseih, as the second part of the conversation focuses a little bit on what is this notions of wasted matter and artistic responses within this. Just to flag, in relation to that turn, colleagues from the Repair Network, Toxic Links, who have been very much pivotal in raising this conversation within in India, and who have just recently created the circular economy package for India, have brought this conversation to Delhi and have been very much partners in making this kind of happen. Again, in terms of actually looking at toxic waste, we have, artistic practices that have preceded this more ecological kind of turn, with Future Farmers looking at Superfund sites and where toxic wastes were dumped since as far back as 2007, and a number of African artists who have been looking at these kind of waste materials in a sense and creating sculptures and installations for them. Given that the context here is also within Ghana, I would just like to flag, before Kisseih comes on stage with me, some of the artists who have been working from Ghana in this particular area, with Gbloshie here using the jerry cans, which are sort of a very symbolic, used here symbolically in a sense to represent the labour of the people who are running in a sense in these very low paid jobs and putting their lives in danger as they try to kind of prop up our global economies. Similar here, Mahama has used the jute bags as a reference to the raw materials that are used to transport goods and services, which was also presented at the Venice Biennale some years back. And as Anof here, who hosts his gallery within town, he said one thing is, of course, somebody's waste is somebody else's raw material, and it's inspired by women from Ghana who kind of use, in a sense, what is around them in particular kind of ways. So that's just to kind of, again, just flag here the context from which we're kind of going to further go into some of the details around the work that we were doing and speaking towards in Republica in Accra. But specifically, I'd like to invite onto stage Kisseih, who will talk in more detail about their film Welcome to Sodom, which was released last year. Thank you. Hi.
Hi. Hi. Yeah.
So can you tell us, Kisseih, a little bit about Welcome to Sodom and actually what was the objective and goal of the film and how it came about?
Thank you so much for the invitation, and thanks to Republica for the invitation and the people here. My name is Kisseih, and I was line producer for the film Welcome to Sodom. The film basically talks about the lives of people living in Sodom and working, and it's also emphasis on individuals who are working with waste in Sodom.
And could you explain what Sodom means for those of us who are not from Accra?
Well, Sodom is a name given to the people living there. You know, when you go back into Bible, Sodom is a place where, you know, like dump place or something like that in the Bible. So the people themselves refer to this place as Sodom and Gomorrah, but the whole place is called Agbogbloshie, and this particular place is called Sodom.
And that area of Agbogbloshie in Accra has historically been a scrapyard. That's correct?
Well, it used to be green place before the arrival of electronic waste and also locally manufactured waste, which are being collected from the city. So it used to be green before before it is tend to be how it is now.
And for people who don't know the site, could you give us an idea of the hectares or the acreage? You know, how big is it?
Well, I find it difficult to just give an exact figure of how big it is, but when you compare it, it could be like a field, like, 4 times bigger, like a football field or something like that.
And can you explain sort of the focus of the film in a way? What was the main emphasis? We can show some of the clips of the people. Would you like to do that next?
Yeah, like I said already, the film is about the people who are living in Sodom, and it is their story. So we've given them the chance to tell their story. So it's basically based on the people who are living in Sodom. And it also focuses on some of the individuals who are, working in this area.
Shall we play the 3 extracts?
Yeah. We have some clips that we will play and probably will give an idea of what we're talking about.
You can't just walk at one place. You have to run about so you get more. Everywhere you can find small iron on the ground. It is like money. But nobody owns it. Every day, they fix a price for the metals. And it is the same price all over the world. And that is the money that I get.
I know how to use computers. If I get a computer, I go and destroy it. I will burn it. The fire always creates something new. The fire can make your heart black deep inside. Nobody will see, but you will turn into a dark creature, a ghost, not a human. Here we are just Africans. But if I can make it to Europe, I really can be somebody.
Sodom is a very special sound. The sound of work. Yeah, but it's not the sound of the machines. It's a human sound. The sound of people working. No other place is that sound. To me, it is like music.
So can you tell us a little bit more about the 3 stories that we saw there, the 3 individuals who are working on the scrapyard?
Well, the guy who is making the music, I met him in Sodom, and he told me that the sounds which is coming out of Sodom It's something that motivates him to make music because he does that to give to the people who are living in the community to enjoy his music. So he's basically working on the scrap yard. He normally burns copper, and after selling them the money he makes, he takes it to a locally manufactured studio where he makes music and gives to the people who are living in this community. And the second one, with the one who was pushing the track, is a guy who is coming from the northern part of Ghana, who believes that life in Sodom could change his life and his family back in the north. So he tried working there for some time, but things are not going in his direction. So he decided that the best way to make a living forward is to leave Sodom and go to Europe, or to live to Europe. And the third one was...
there was D-Boy was the last one. Then there was the burner, and the first one was...
the one with the girl. This is a small girl she is a girl actually, but decided to tell people who are living in Sodom that he's a boy. Because she believes that when you are a boy in Sodom, you could make more money than the women who are working there. So she tells everybody in Sodom is aware that she is a boy. And in this case, she could make a lot of money. And her job is normally when the big guys finish working, she goes around with a magnet, which she uses to pick most of the small metals that are found on the floor. She picks them and then sells them to make some money.
Thank you. And could you tell us a little bit about how you actually met each of the protagonists in the film, and what was your relationship with them, and how did you get such deep connect with them?
Well, actually, the whole project started 2014. We were in Ghana. This time was basically to work there, to support them, to feel with them, to understand them, basically. Because the film is about the people living there, and to make a film about them, then it's very important to spend time with them. So this 2014 was the time that we did that, and we spent time with them, and we developed this kind of connection with them. So when we came back to Europe 2016, we went back, and we still have this connection, because we normally talk on phone, the writer, they send us pictures. So we have this relationship with them, and this was for us so easy to work with them 2016.
Mm-hmm. And you currently live in Vienna, so I guess the fact that you're also from Ghana and speak the language helped to facilitate this relationship with the filmmakers and the directors as well.
Yeah. For me, it was so easy because I understand the culture, and I understand if somebody is telling me something from Sodom, I know what is true and what is not true, and I know how best to get the story from them. Mm-hmm. And this was the role that I play most in Sodom.
Taking that role, how do you sort of see artists' responsibility actually when working with communities who are working perhaps in quite disadvantaged situations? It's obviously quite toxic on the rubbish dump or the scrap heap. What would be, for example, the average wage of a person?
Well, they don't really earn anything, €1, €2. Of course, there will be some people who, making a little bit money, but that is no money for me. And I think the responsibility for artists working there is to get the best story out of Sodom. You have to live with them, you have to work with them, you have to understand them. You have to feel the same, the same situation just like they are in. And when you do this, they develop this kind of trust with you, and then they tell you everything. Because most of them are already used to media coming there, spending a day or 2 hours or something, and they've already have their spectacular pictures about the place. So they are really aware of that. This is why when you really want to work there, then you really have to spend a lot of time there and to understand them better.
And are you continuing those relationships, or where are they now after the success of the movie last year?
Yeah, well, I still have connection with them. I talk to most of them. In Sodom, when you work there, there are a lot of stories in this area, and some of these stories, what remains with me, and I still remember them. And considering D-Boy, the guy who is making the music, his story, I think it's something good that we have to support, even though I believe he is in a situation where he is trying to turn waste into something that could be used again, but not just that, but also think about the people who are living there to satisfy them with their music. Because of this, I'm trying to help him, support him, share ideas with him, and see how best we could, promote his music.
And can you give people who don't know, again, the area, a flavor of the living conditions and the working conditions of people that are working on the scrapyard?
Well, when you get there, of course, the first thing you see is the smoke. You always see the smoke in the air, and there are so many pieces of metals on the floor. Things are scattered all over. But when you stay there longer, you realize that these things are really organized. If you understand them, you might see them just on the floor, but they are really, really, really organized. Of course, the environment is not encouraging, but people are still, using their creativity in this situation.
And when we were there in Accra, I would sort of describe it as a village that is there. I mean, there's a whole ecosystem of people living and working on the site. Animals are there. People live on the dump. And could you give a little bit of a flavor of to what your understanding was of how people feel about living there? Do they see themselves living there continuously? I mean, you mentioned that one wants to go to Europe, but what are their feelings about the health conditions or the living conditions that they have?
Well, one thing I've realized while working there is, of course, I know they have some kind of difficulties, and when you live in Sodom, of course, you can always survive for the next day. And when you live there, you even forget where you are because, when we were working there, we spent 3 months, and it got to a time that I don't even realize where I was. I have this connection with them. I don't even think of anything about the environment. For me, it's like we wake up in the morning and then we have to go there, and the people are so, open to us. So when you live there long, you forget that the environment is not a place where you could stay and work.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. We'd like to open out the conversation to the audience. So I don't know if anybody has a question for this moment in time, and if we could have a bit of a time check also on where we're at. Yeah, thank you. I think it's just standing up. I think they have a microphone in the middle of the room, so.
Hello. Thank you for the talk and for the presentation of the movie. Could you give us a bit of more historical context? Because I know about the film, but I haven't seen it yet. So could you give us a rough sketch about the historical context? How did this develop there? And are there any policy concerns about this, or is this a concern of local policy or not, or what's the context there? Thanks.
Yeah, of course there is intervention of government. Government is in more or less in charge of this place, and there are NGOs also, working in this area to improve the lives of the people. The people living there, but the people themselves have their own society. When you want to go there, there's somebody who is in charge of the place that you have to talk to first of all, and he will give you somebody that will take you around to look around. And when you do this, then you are welcome. You can go there alone whenever you want, and when you have a problem, then you have to come to the one who is in charge of the whole place. But one thing I also know is of course, most people they pass there, but they don't really go inside because of the description being given to Sodom. But when you go inside, you realize that it's a different situation there.
I mean, the site traditionally would have been always an area of scrap metal. It had also been a lagoon, and there was plans, I think, in the 60s and 70s to make it into a kind of a park. But somehow the community of people who are recycling there sort of grew. And then also it's one of the, I guess, largest working, let's say, scrapyard recycling sites that's close to a city, and so therefore it has gotten quite a lot of media attention because of that. Usually these sites are kind of a bit more hidden and not so close to a city. I mean, you can get there within, depending on traffic, 20 minutes from the centre of Accra. When we were presenting the conversation at Republica in Accra, as Kisseih said, there's a number of large NGOs who have been working there for several decades, and more recently also they're trying to establish now a health centre to address some of the conditions that people are, it's environmentally hazardous, toxic space to kind of work in. But because the wages are low and the people are looking for making money in a short space of time, they will actually take this condition in a sense. But you were mentioning breathing problems and skin diseases and so forth that people have, and also it's very difficult to anticipate somebody's age there because speaking to some of the colleagues and also the people that you saw in the film, their ages sort of are quite sporadic. So actually, let's say historical documentation of that type, how long people have been working there, where they come from, is very, very difficult to kind of gather, as is information about the amount of, the facts and figures basically of the sites. It depends on which organisation that you might go to. I mean, there is research and many sort of academic and policy papers kind of around it, but it's still kind of emerging. What else can we say also about it historically? There's definitely, when we were in Accra, there's a conversation now about looking at, and it's a movement that's also echoed in India through our colleagues Toxic Links, about people who are working on these sites who are in very poor conditions beginning to collate and think about themselves as green workers, and they're actually at the forefront in some ways of thinking about this. So Kalabala Connect is an NGO in Chennai, for example, in India, that looking at the aggregation of providing aggregation services and platforms through which people who are working in the informal rubbish collection centre can start to actually have some more control of their daily wage and not be at the mercy, in a sense, of kind of middle people who kind of can dominate the price that they get. You also have different tiers of informal rubbish, let's say collectors. You have the people that, I'm not speaking now directly about the site at Accra, but in India, which if anybody has been there, you'll notice particularly within the cities, the cycle of rubbish collection. So you get the people who do the shift work between 3 to 6 in the morning, tend to be the most precarious and actually just collecting, and then you get the sorters who put it into particular collections, and then they go to the middle people, and then the middle people then go to the bigger conglomerates, and that's kind of how it works. So what we were having discussions about in Accra as well is how that informal sector, in a sense, is now also somehow being legitimised and actually is becoming more formal. But there's a danger there in the formality of that actually it negates, the very, very precarious situation that some people are in. You don't necessarily want to make a black market formal. But I'm saying that with trepidation. But some of the people that are working in such sites are often very, very, very vulnerable, and not necessarily wanting to be, to be in that data pool, so to speak. So, thank you. So I think that when we sort of speak about these broader questions around policy change, responsible consumption and production, the UN sustainability goals, we're sort of seeing a shift in the conversation around what is essentially the informal sector that's working in this sort of space, which is why it was interesting, and I found it necessary to kind of map repair businesses within Bristol, because it's sort of, you could take the square mile as the lens through which you could actually have this discussion in Berlin. You could have this discussion as a methodological framework in other cities to kind of start to look at the same sort of timelines and begin to understand better, what shifts are actually happening and where the vulnerabilities are. Is that helping? Yeah. I mean, they're quite like, they're very, very, very complex sites, actually, through which I think, this nucleus of this broken world logic is being enacted in a very vibrant way and in a very precarious way. Any other questions?
Hi, thank you for the talk and for the presentation. I was wondering, from my perspective, I also come from the global south, and normally, there's a lot of situations concerning sustainability and concerning labor that are seen from the outside as manageable from the perspective of national politics. But actually, my experience is that all the treats that are related with exchanging goods or services are always like a two-side thing. And if you change something in your country, let's say in my case, it's Uruguay, we changed something about sustainability or politics, then we got something cut off from the other side. So could you say a little bit more, this service that it's given to the north in Sodom is related to some other good treats, or do you receive something in exchange? Is this part of a larger economic treat, or I don't know if it's clear. But
I don't understand it very well. But
okay. Yeah, it's also still complicated for me to formulate it. You are giving a service for the global north in Sodom. But this is, in my experience, these kind of things are not isolated contracts. These are much broader contracts that are the Article 1 says you're going to give this service in Sodom, and the Article 2 says we're going to give you, I don't know, whatever, some food or some technology or some. And so if you cut off the service in Sodom, we are also cutting off the service that we are giving you. So is Sodom a really isolated thing that can be treated, or is it, if we cut up Sodom, then the country runs out of some other service that it's receiving because of this?
Well, yes, Sodom is more or less isolated somehow. It's in Accra, but most people don't really, go to this place because it's being tagged with certain names or something like that. But one thing I know is it is difficult to say, okay, we close Sodom or something like that, because there are so many people working there, a lot of people. When you close it, there's no way all these people are going, because they are also making money from whatever is coming to Sodom. And therefore, they sometimes play politics with it, because it's very difficult to just tell these old people, everybody has to move, let's close the place. There wouldn't be any place. You have to provide them place, and moreover, when you decided to cut it or something like that, then of course there will be so many that will be scattered in the country, but not just in Sodom, but you could find it somewhere in the north or somewhere in the south. So it will be distributed in the country. I don't know if I've given you.
I think also what's interesting is that when we were speaking to colleagues that are working in the government in Ghana about this issue, and what I see happening trend-wise from the different, stakeholders and actors that I see within this, particularly from the Repair Networks, Repair Acts network, is that in the Global South now there's this. Well, let's put it this way, for example, China don't want to take now some of the rubbish that they're having, so they're pushing it back to Africa and to India, and it's going into sort of a black market. Those countries are then having to sort of in some way stand up to this and sort of be transparent about it, and also trying to look for other solutions through it, because there has to be acknowledgement that it's going somewhere. It can't all go into the sea in a way. So the flow, in a sense, that you're talking about, it is globally connected, and it's actually just trying to, from what I understood from speaking with people in the ministry in Ghana, is that they're trying to actually look at this in somehow a positive manner as opposed to in a negative manner, and sort of look at what innovations may lie in that problem, in a sense, and how can up an issue become actually the most effective and most innovative, perhaps, mass recycling area that we have. And I think that's quite an aspiration, kind of aspect of what's kind of going on there. That's one narrative, of course, that's going on in terms of a kind of a policy and a planning, and there's money going towards that from the German government to the government in Ghana to support that. What the film Welcome to Sodom, though, is highlighting, which often doesn't get highlighted, is this deep personal relationship of the people who are actually working there, who may have no understanding of what that more economic, national, international narrative is, or they have, but they're operating simultaneously at different levels, at the same site, which is what I was meaning when I was saying it was really complex. And I think what is interesting in this case is that, filmmakers and artists went in under the belly, in a sense, and pulled out these stories, which pulls out a very different narrative to what maybe a narrative that a government or a particular NGO or a charity might actually want to look at. But they are service agreements. Yes, you're right. I mean, this is how these things work, are through service agreements and contracts with companies and with multinationals, and it's big business. Yeah.
I think that's why most probably critics are coming from, because everybody is having his own agenda of what is happening in Sodom, of course. So I think we just have to know where some of these critics are coming from, because you're all having connection into what is happening in Sodom.
I would like to know if the film had some influence on the conditions of the lives of the people featured in your film, and how the reaction to the film by the people featured in the film was. Because I sometimes if you change something in the conditions, then the people might not react in a positive way, even if we, as from our Eurocentric point of view, we say, well, now the world knows about this place, but they live there and they work there and make a living there, and so it's not in their horizon that's not their goal maybe to close that place down, as you said, even if for their health it would be better.
Well, I think it has some kind of, I don't know, the protagonist in the film has certain kind of changes. First of all, like I said already, the film is done based on the story of the people. There are so many agencies that are working in Sodom, but one thing that make me really wanted to be part of this is that this has a connection with everybody, including me, who is living here, having the chance to live here, has this kind of connection. And if we really want to change the lives of people living in Sodom, then I think it's a good idea that people who live also not in Sodom also knows exactly what is going on in Sodom, because it has connection on both of us, because Sodom might be far away from here, but I think Sodom is existing because certain things from here end up in Sodom. And we cannot just always say, okay, let's give them money to solve the problem. But when we change our mind, then there's no need of giving the money, but we're really contributing to the problem of what is happening in Sodom.
I think also at the end of the day, there just needs to be a radical shift in thinking about how we consume electronics, in a sense. Like, you know, if you pay 400 quid for a phone, there should be a portion of that that does go to the people who are dealing with it as a waste product, because it will have to be dealt with at some point in its lifespan at that point. And particularly because they're like pushing particular closure on, you know, licenses in the centre, you get bumped off your phone because, you know, you haven't upgraded it, etc., etc. You know, these policies are going to actually have to kind of be, you know, radically shifted, really, in a sense, if we're to reach any of the 2050 targets for the UN sustainability goals. Otherwise, we're just sitting in our own crap for longer, which, you know, maybe for some people the world ending is not, you know, it's not a sad thing. Fair enough, grand. But, you know, while we're living here at the moment and breathing, we may as well try to actually, like, think about it in a better way. So I think that for me, you know, meeting Kisseih, finding out about the film, going to Accra, you know, spending time with the people, some of the people who are in the film, you know, the reality of what it does is it brings those people's living conditions, you know, in a very visceral way, through the nature of the aesthetics that they chose of the film, you know, present in a sense, and you begin to ask questions, if you haven't already, about these things. And I think that it's probably going to be considered a criminal act in some ways about the way that we're producing tech at the moment. Because in the end of the day, someone like the guy at the end clip who's a musician, you know, his life story is very particular. He came from the north. His father died when he was a really young man. He was forced to go to work not forced, but had to go to work in the city. He hasn't had a chance to have an education, and he's the person that's dealing with, you know, as I said, you know, the detritus of our products, and people are beginning to flip their phone every couple of months or every year. So I think this work, for me, that's kind of where the power of these narratives and stories lie in what we see in the film. When I spoke with D-Boy, he knows that it's not a good place to work. You know, he's trying to get out of it through his music. But in the end of the day, it pays him better than many other things. And he likes living there because he has his community of people. They're very tight communities. That's the other thing, you know. It's going back to this sort of responsibility as artists. It's almost part of that discourse of ethnographic approaches. You know, you have to tread lightly and tread carefully when you're telling these stories, so that they don't become, you know, a form of extraction in their own right. And I think that's quite a challenge that we have, in a sense, that sits on the boundary of some of these practices, you know. How do you kind of place emphasis on that while at the same time your movie becomes really successful and, you know, you become the art star or whatever? Yeah, they're not easy things to answer, but I think for me there is something in this potential around, you know, being able to have more control and decision around where the money sits, and when you purchase a bit of tech, and when you purchase a phone or a laptop or a computer, and what we can actually start to demand through the Repair Act legislations, and also sort of start to think about these circular economies, the cradle to the grave cycles of actually what we're consuming. And hopefully that would have an impact, you know, on somebody like D-Boy, that there is an educational fund for him, you know, or there is a better living condition, or he gets part of that dosh, in a sense, the slice of that cake. Is that it? Yeah, great. Thank you for your questions and time. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
We